Thank you for joining us today for the third webinar of the exciting series, Connecting People and Science, hosted by the CitSci Alberta Community of Practice. Today's webinar is Transformative Tools Managing Big Data with our special guest, Kyle Horner from Birds Canada. My name is Stephanie Weisenbach. I am the Executive Director of Nature Alberta and a member of the CitSci Alberta Community of Practice Steering Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. I want to take a moment before we go any further to acknowledge the place in which we live, work, and play. The members of the CitSci Alberta Community of Practice come from all across the land we know as Alberta, which is the ancestral homelands of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Treaty 4, Treaty 6, Treaty 7, Treaty 8, Treaty 10, and 22 Métis districts. Indigenous peoples have met, gathered, hunted, and stewarded this land long before the arrival of settlers. We recognize that this relationship between Indigenous communities and the land continues on to this day. Traditional knowledge and ways of knowing of the Indigenous peoples are an important component of citizen science, and we are committed to finding opportunities to combine Western science and traditional knowledge in our practices. Today's host, the CitSci Alberta Community of Practice, or CitSci Alberta, brings together individuals and organizations to grow a citizen science community of practice, build capacity and tools, and also enable the use of citizen science data. The CitSci Alberta Community of Practice is directed by a steering committee, many of whom are here today. We are always open to having more people on our steering committee, so if you're interested and have time, please reach out. If you would like to get in touch with us or keep up to date with any of our future events, we are on both Facebook and Instagram at CitSci Alberta. You can also check out our website or send us an email as well. And the website also has resources that can further support your professional journey as well, so make sure you check it out. We have a couple of poll questions to get to know a little bit more about you and the community of practice who are here today. So Kiara, our technical moderator, is sharing that poll now. So first question is, what is your affiliation? And the second question is your primary area of focus. So we'll give you a moment to select those boxes. And I'm going to guess most people, or a majority, might be an area focus of biodiversity today. We'll wait and see when Kiara is able to share the results here. That's wonderful. So we have a range of different areas that we're coming from. And we have the majority here is water and a high percentage of biodiversity focus. So thank you so much for answering those polls. That really gives us a good idea of who's here. And if you have a topic of interest for a future webinar, please add it in the chat or reach out to us by email. In 2018, this community of practice met at our first in-person workshop and identified recommendations that were then released into the Principles of Good Practice document in 2020. This year, on October 30th, we will build on this work. The day will include celebrating the achievements of our community of practice, providing opportunities for networking and learning from each other, working together to strategize ways to enable the use of citizen science data. Krista Tremblay and Dana Duke will be leading us with examples of how citizen science is driving change, which is our overall theme. And the remainder of the day will be used for workshopping how to action citizen science data. So we'll be looking at our hub website and getting kind of an exclusive look on that new hub launch as well. The next webinar in the series is with Dr. Patrick Hannington from the University of Alberta, called Place-Based Partnerships. He will present on his eDNA research and the community focus his work has had. Our agenda today includes our speaker today will present for approximately 40 minutes, and then the steering committee has prepared a special question for Kyle to answer related to our overall theme of the series. And then we will have time for questions from all of you. Questions posted in the chat box will be collected throughout the presentation, so please feel free to add your questions there as we go. And Kristen Maynor will facilitate a question period after the presentation. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Through our Connecting People and Science series, we aim to discuss a variety of topics, including place-based partnerships and monitoring to drive change. And today's webinar is Transformative Tools Managing Big Data. Today we have with us Kyle Horner from Birds Canada. He is a lifelong birdwatcher and science communicator based in Guelph, Ontario. As the NatureCounts engagement coordinator at Birds Canada, he works to raise awareness and adoption of the NatureCounts data platform and to help users make the most of this unique resource. Currently, he is part of a team who developed the State of Canada's Birds, a new online resource that makes citizen science bird data accessible, understandable, and meaningful to all Canadians. We're excited to explore the importance of transformative technology with you, and we hope you'll find the insights shared to be both relevant and inspiring. Without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Kyle.
All righty, well, thanks so much, Steph. I'll get my screen up here. Hopefully it all works. All righty. Good deal. Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good just noon, morning, wherever you are, whatever time it is. It's great to be here with you all today. My name is Kyle, as you heard, and I am the NatureCounts engagement coordinator at Birds Canada, which I feel is a sentence that maybe takes a little bit of explaining in a way. But that's okay, because we're gonna cover that today. So whether or not you're familiar with NatureCounts, it doesn't matter, because we're going to cover all the important details. I'm going to tell you a little bit today about NatureCounts, why it exists, what it is, and how it works. And then I'll take the last little bit of my time today as well to introduce our newest and most exciting development, which is the State of Canada's Birds, which Steph mentioned in the introduction. But before we do all that, I feel I should start with just a little bit about Birds Canada, because maybe not everybody here is familiar with Birds Canada. That would be quite fair, of course. So you should know that Birds Canada is a national charitable organization which works towards the conservation of birds and their habitats. So it's kind of maybe what you would guess from the name, I suppose, formerly known as Bird Studies Canada. So you may be familiar with it by that slightly older name. And there's lots of ways that Birds Canada pursues the conservation of birds in Canada. This is not an exhaustive list, but it gives you an idea of some of the things that we do. One of those, the biggest ways, is by mobilizing and engaging with a very large network of citizen scientists. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that today, certainly. Birds Canada is also involved in on-the-ground research and conservation work, population monitoring, migration monitoring, and all sorts of advocacy and stakeholder engagement as well. So that includes identifying priority places for birds. That includes working with government agencies and other organizations to build partnerships and work towards conservation. And then we also try to connect with everyday Canadians and people in Canada about birds and get people excited about birds and conservation as well. And the State of Canada's Birds, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, is one way that we are doing that. The reason I kind of give you this list is to get to a point, actually, and that point is that almost everything that we do at Birds Canada either collects data, so our research activities and citizen science activities, they collect data, or in the case of things like advocacy and identifying priority places and things like that, our activities require data. So we generate data and we need data. So basically, we deal with a lot of data, and nowhere is that more apparent than in our citizen science programs. So as we know, as you, I'm sure, know very well, as a network of citizen science folks, citizen science is an incredible way to generate a large amount of data, a far larger amount of data than could ever be collected by professional researchers. Birds Canada is engaged in citizen science across the country through programs like breeding bird atlases, nocturnal owl surveys, marsh monitoring. We have a couple dozen programs currently active across Canada and partnerships beyond our own programs as well. So there's no doubt that citizen science is our number one source of bird and biodiversity data. And so that's something that we deal with a great deal. It's a fantastic asset for conservation. But it does come with its own challenges as well, because citizen science generates so much data, it has such incredible capacity to generate data, those data need to be managed. And that can be quite a daunting challenge. And it was a daunting challenge for Birds Canada, especially in the early 2000s. So in the early 2000s, Birds Canada had all these programs collecting data across the country, but they were all kind of functioning separately. They were doing their own thing. So a program in BC was collecting data and a program in Newfoundland was collecting data, and they didn't really talk to each other. And they each had their own protocols and they each kept their data in their own sort of silo. And this was a real issue. It was an issue because it was difficult to ensure the quality of the data. It was difficult to coordinate so that it was all collected in a way that was compatible with each other and could be compared and contrasted. It was difficult to make good use of the data or even to find the data that you need because it was kept in all these different places. And it was very difficult to share the data as well. As this resource was growing, people external to Birds Canada were realizing it was there and they were asking to use it, but it was very difficult to share because it had to be mined from all these different places and the formatting was all different. It was just a big problem. So that's why NatureCounts exists today. NatureCounts was launched in 2008, initially as essentially an internal solution to data management at Birds Canada, but it very quickly grew into an open data platform that collects data on birds from all over the place, not just from within Birds Canada programs, but from other programs as well. And then it strives to make those data available and accessible to anyone who's working to conserve birds and their habitats. So that's open data. It's data in, but also data out, and trying to leverage those data and get people to use them to help birds. I think often of NatureCounts as a sort of critical link, or for lack of a better word, a middleman between people and groups who collect data and those who can use data to make a positive difference for birds. Sometimes those are the same people, but often they're different. You've got groups of citizen scientists and researchers who are collecting lots of data, and then you've got conservation actors, policy makers, all sorts of people who need those data to actually make a measurable difference for birds. And so NatureCounts really sits in the middle. And not only do we try to connect the data with the people who need them, but we try to support people on both sides as well. So we're trying to support folks on the data collection side and give them the tools they need to collect good, reliable data easily. And then on the flip side, we're trying to work with data users to make sure they can get the data they need as easily as possible, and they have the tools they need to use it effectively for the purposes of research and conservation. So that's us right there in the middle, trying to help people on both sides and kind of make the connections. NatureCounts has grown a great deal from its sort of introduction as an internal data management tool. These days, it hosts over 244 million occurrence records, mostly of birds, although increasingly we're starting to see a few other taxa as well. But that's huge. I mean, I think all of iNaturalist has about 200 million records. So we've got 244 plus million records of pretty much just birds, which really makes it Canada's number one source of information on birds anywhere. And the vast, vast majority of those records are generated from citizen science programs. And so that really shows you the magnitude of the citizen science effort in Canada. Of course, the whole point of having these data is for them to be used, and we do see them used quite regularly. So we've furnished about 120,000 data requests over the years, providing billions of records for folks to use for research and conservation. And that's really a sign that there's a great need for these data, a great use for them, if we can simply get them in the hands of the people who need them. So that's sort of the very quick Cole's notes on NatureCounts and sort of where it came from and why it exists today. But on a practical level, it's kind of nice to know how it works and how maybe you as a citizen scientist, or maybe a data user if you are one, how you fit into that picture. It all starts with data collection. So if we're going to talk about NatureCounts and those 244 million records, we should know how they get here. There are several different ways that data can arrive in NatureCounts. The first, and probably the most common now, is through mobile data entry. So we have an app for that. It is 2024. You got to have an app for that for sure. And I, as a person who was not directly involved in the development of the app, feel very comfortable saying that it's pretty cool. It's a really awesome tool. I'm not bragging because I didn't develop it myself, but I have used it a lot and it is fantastic. It's really dialed towards specifically citizen science data collection. That's what it's designed for, and that's what it does extremely well. It supports lots of different protocols for observation. Currently, there are about 24 projects actively using the app to collect their data. And that's everything from an eBird style checklist to specialized surveys for, say, owls or nightjars to point counts. You know, if you've ever done an old-fashioned paper point count, I've done lots of them in my life, where you have a piece of paper with rings on it and you're writing in pencil the birds that you're seeing and hearing, and you're making arrows and all that stuff. And then you bring your paper home later and you transpose the data onto your computer or onto some online submission form. Well, this is the new way. No more paper and pencil, no more transposition later. You can do it all on your phone. You can drop pins on a map. It's super, super slick. And then it submits directly to NatureCounts in exactly the right format, ready to go right from the field. So this mobile data entry to me is a huge development in citizen science data collection and something that we're continuing to develop and to build to make it even better and more broadly applicable in the future. For those who prefer it a bit more old school, we do have traditional web data entry. So if you are collecting your data on a paper form, you can come on home and type it into your computer, or if some projects the app maybe isn't quite as suited for, we've got that online data entry as an option. We've got bulk uploads as well. So for historic data sets, completed data sets, they can be uploaded into NatureCounts all in one shot, even if they predate NatureCounts. So for example, here in Ontario, we're currently on our third breeding bird atlas, and the first two atlases were completed long before NatureCounts existed, but that doesn't mean they're not there. They've been uploaded as complete data sets, so now you can look at all three atlases across Ontario. You can compare and contrast very easily, all within NatureCounts. Actually, the data in NatureCounts go back over 100 years. So it's quite a long running historical data set as well. And then the fourth way the data find their way into NatureCounts is through partnerships. So not only are we gaining data from our own citizen science programs and other programs which directly come to us to host data, but we're also importing data from partners like Wild Tracks, like eBird, like Audubon Christmas bird counts. And so that makes NatureCounts really and truly a one-stop shop for bird data in Canada, the most complete collection of bird data in Canada, and the only place probably that you need to go to get it. And that's the goal anyway, is to make it as complete and as comprehensive as possible. Now, as I say, having all these data, it's only useful if people use it. And in order to do that, we're always striving to abide to something called the FAIR principles of data management. And this is a set of guidelines that helps you make open data as accessible and usable as possible. So first and foremost, we're trying to make sure the data are findable. Now, already by consolidating the data from all these different sources under one umbrella, that improves the findability of each of these smaller projects. And then on top of that, we're out there doing what I'm doing today, spreading the good word about NatureCounts, really trying to raise awareness and adoption of this platform so that people know that it exists and that it's easy to find the data you need there. Once you found it, the data have to be accessible. You have to be able to get your mitts on it. Very, very important that there is an easy and barrier-free process to accessing the data. And we'll talk a little bit about data access in a moment. The data have to be interoperable, so you have to be able to use them together. So if I'm getting data on let's say a great horned owl, and I'm getting some of that data from a nocturnal owl survey, and some of that data from a breeding bird atlas, and some of that data from a Christmas bird count, I need to be able to analyze those together to compare and contrast and work with them all in the same workflow. If they're all in different formats, that gets very, very difficult. So they have to be interoperable, and they have to be reusable as well. It may seem obvious that you could reuse data over and over again, but I don't know how many times in the past it's happened where maybe somebody collects data for a PhD project. They spend 3 or 4 years in the field collecting data. They do their analysis, finish their PhD, and off they go. And nobody ever sees that data again. And it's really too bad, because data is a renewable resource. It has endless potential to be used and analyzed. And so we need to make sure that data can be used over and over again. And so we can extract as much knowledge as possible from the data that are available. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to keep it fair. We're trying to give people everything they need to access and use the data that people have worked so painstakingly to collect. A couple of different ways we do that. One is with our data standards. Very simply, all of our data is accompanied by what we call metadata. Metadata just means a set of information that tells you how, why, when, where, and by whom the data were collected. So if I'm accessing data and I'm going to analyze it, I need to know how it was collected and who and where and all those important pieces of information. I need to know who to ask if I have any questions about it. I need to know who to credit for the collection of the data, because somebody worked really hard to collect it. And I need to know if there's any additional data available that might complement what I'm doing. So metadata does that. And in NatureCounts, there's no random data floating around. It's all tied to its source. It's tied to that metadata. So any researcher knows exactly what they need to know to use it. And then we make sure as well that all the data are formatted in a universal way. And this speaks to that interoperability piece. All the data are formatted the same. So if you're gathering data from 20 different projects, that's okay. You can still work with it all together. You can analyze it all together. And that makes life as easy as possible for those researchers as well. And we have to think a lot about data security too. Open data is great. Open data is all about free sharing of data. But there are some security concerns. We have to think about things like sensitive species, endangered species. If we're going to share data on endangered species, or things like owls, which are very easily harassed, we have to think about that. We have to be careful. We have to think about private property. So data that's collected on private property or sensitive locations. We have to think about groups like Indigenous groups with data sovereignty concerns, which is a very valid thing as well. So we have to really focus on data, finding the balance, I guess, between data sharing and openness and data security. There are lots of ways we do that, but a couple of the simpler ways. One is that we make sure that whoever contributes the data owns the data. So when I say that NatureCounts hosts millions of records of birds, it doesn't mean that we own it. It's still owned by the people who originally contributed the data, whether that's a breeding bird atlas or some other program. The original contributor owns the data. And that's really important, because it means they retain authority over the data and they can decide how it's shared. So if I run a breeding bird atlas and then I submit that data to NatureCounts, I can decide on how those data are accessed. What is the level of access? How much permission is required? That sort of thing as well. And so this helps us to just make sure that data are being shared as openly as possible, but that we're protecting the security of the birds and the people who shared the data as well. Once we thought about all that boring stuff, maybe it's not boring, interesting stuff, valuable stuff, then we can get down to data access. And that's the most exciting part. I know collecting data is exciting. I love being in the field, but realistically, the whole reason we do it is so that the data can be accessed and used. And so that's the exciting part, is providing access to the data, seeing it come together, and seeing people able to use it. We can access data in a few ways on the NatureCounts website, and you can pop on and explore this yourself. One of the nicest ways to interact with the data is through maps. And so we can generate species maps here for any species in Canada. For example, Canada Jay. This is a breeding evidence map for Canada Jay. So each of those little squares represents an atlas square, basically a 10 by 10 kilometer square. And if the square is red, that means Canada Jay is confirmed to breed there. If it's orange, it's probable that it breeds there. If it's yellow, it's possible. And if it's green, it's simply observed there, but with no breeding evidence. And so this is a great way to start to visualize where the species is on the landscape, where we know that it's breeding, maybe where there are holes in the existing data, or where it would be nice to know a little bit more. So it's the first way that we can start to interact with those data in NatureCounts. We can generate trend maps as well. So this is a map of regional population trends for Canada warbler. So each dot represents a region from the Breeding Bird Survey, the North American Breeding Bird Survey. And if the dot is red, that means the population in that region is declining. And if the dot is blue, that means the population in that region is increasing. So we're actually seeing population change on the map in a visual way. And that's really, I think, an exciting way to kind of visualize what's going on with birds and maybe start your inquiry into bird populations. And if you were a researcher, you might start getting an idea of where you were going with your research by being able to visualize the data in this way. And then, of course, once you're done visualizing, you can access the raw data. And for most of our users, most of our researchers and conservation actors, this is what they need. They need their hands on the actual raw data from these hundreds of projects that are available to them. You can filter the data by species, by project. You can draw a little shape on the map, and you can get all of the records from these hundreds of projects that are confined to that little shape on the map, which is really useful for some studies and impact assessment and things like that. And we're always working on introducing new ways that people can filter and query and access the data as well. And then you can go ahead and submit a request and you can get a hold of the data that you need for your research project or study or whatever it may be. We also, if you happen to be a real stats person, a real data nerd, which I must admit I am only by proxy. I'm not a genuine data nerd, even though I try. But we have an R package as well. And that's just a statistical tool that helps researchers to pull data directly into their analysis. So we're just trying to make it as easy as possible for researchers to get the data in the format they need it. And so the R package is one of those. All this means that the data can be used in lots of different ways, and we see them used in countless ways. It's almost hard to count how many possible applications there are of a resource like this. But lots of different ways that we see NatureCounts data being used. We often see it used, for example, in species assessment. So when we talk about species at risk, when it comes to birds, if you're assessing a species at risk bird in Canada, at this point, you are using NatureCounts data. You're using data from this resource. And why wouldn't you be? Because it's got this complete picture of long-term trends and abundance in that species. So it's a great way to visualize or to see and analyze what direction the population of that species is headed. We can use the data to assess threats and to see trends in different regions, to propose conservation action, and then to continue to monitor and see how that conservation action is doing. Is it being successful? Is it not hitting the mark? Well, we have the data to tell us that. And we can identify trends and produce reports as well for the public. And that's something that we'll see in a little bit too. We see the data used quite regularly in land use planning. That could be everything from protecting spaces as parks or conservation areas, determining what areas are priority for protection. It could be informing different land use. So how is agriculture or resource extraction or wind energy or development affecting birds in different places? And how can we restore habitat or manage habitat to be better for birds? And how can we mitigate the impacts of some of these land use practices on birds? We see the data used a lot in impact assessment. So this is the process that happens when development is going to happen. So if somebody's going to build a subdivision or a road or a mine or a shopping mall, they need to go through the process of environmental impact assessment. And it's all well and good to go out a few times and survey the area and say, yep, these are the birds that live here. But it's much better if you can also say, and here are all the records of birds from this area for the last 100 years. And that gives us a really nice complete picture of the birds that live here. It allows us to say when development is not going to be too harmful or when it is going to be too harmful. It allows folks to propose mitigation or to changes to that development to make it better for birds as well. So the value of the data and impact assessment is huge. We see used in education. So this free resource is a great way for professors to introduce students to population research and open data. So it's a wonderful data set to use just to learn how to work with data like that. We see it fueling a lot of graduate and undergraduate research projects and even being used to engage the general public with birds in Canada, which again is something that State of Canada's Birds is really doing, which we'll talk about in a moment. And finally, we see a ton of use in research. And just about any facet of bird research that you can imagine, it's very logical that we would use the data to learn where birds live or maybe how their populations are doing over time. And we can also use it to understand the timing of certain events like nesting or migration. We can use it really to propose conservation measures, and we can use it to understand some pretty big ideas like the current biodiversity crisis and even climate change. And so there are really countless applications of these data for research, and I think that's very exciting. the most exciting part of all this to me is that I always have to remind myself when I'm talking about data use that this is a body of citizen science data. And I think when we do citizen science, when we go out and we participate in a citizen science project, sometimes we do it just because we enjoy it. Sometimes we do it because we have a sense that it's important, and we certainly hope the data are going to be used for something good and something valuable. But I think it's great to really know, and for me, it has been to see firsthand that like these data are absolutely fueling research and conservation in Canada. It's not trivial by any means, and the bulk of data that are being used for research and conservation of birds in Canada come from citizen science specifically. And I think that really speaks to how powerful it is as an institution. A couple of specific examples. I really like specific examples just because they're interesting, or I think so anyways. So I talked a little bit about species assessment. You may be familiar with a bird that's near and dear to us at Birds Canada because it adorns our logo, and that is the Canada warbler. And Canada warbler was designated by CIWIC in 2020 as a species of special concern using data from NatureCounts. CIWIC, if you're not familiar, that's the committee which advises basically the government of Canada on which species to list as species at risk. And so in 2020, CIWIC used all the historical data from NatureCounts, and they said Canada warbler is declining, and it should be listed as a species at risk, a species of special concern. And then I love to see the data come full circle. And in 2023, Birds Canada participated in an international study which re-examined some of the ways that we assess species using the Canada warbler as its model, and then provided conservation recommendations for Canada warbler, all based on data from NatureCounts as well. And so not only can we use the data to assess species, we can also use the data to propose conservation for the species, and even to re-examine how we talk about species at risk. Data from NatureCounts is also really integral to identifying Canada's key biodiversity areas. These are areas of priority for the conservation of biodiversity in Canada. And they are, in much the same way that CIWIC advises the government about species to list as at risk, KBAs are essentially advising that these areas, these places, are important for biodiversity conservation and should be protected. And these sites are a big part of Canada's commitment under the new Global Biodiversity Framework. So the Global Biodiversity Framework, the UN Global Biodiversity Framework, specifies a goal of conserving 30% of land and water by 2030. And Canada has committed to that goal, and these KBAs are going to play a role in that. And so that's very exciting as well. And finally, in 2022, data from NatureCounts were used to anticipate the impact of climate change by Parks Canada, basically in Canada's national parks. And I don't think about bird occurrence data as being a key in climate change, but they can be. And so the National Parks of Canada used data to try to decide how climate change is going to affect the birds that live in national parks, and how can the managers of national parks adapt their practices to help birds continue to thrive and survive as we see more and more impacts from climate change. And so I think that's kind of a nifty application that I wouldn't have considered at some point, that it can even be a key part in adapting to climate change. We know basically that these data are crucial. The value of data like this is starting to be recognized on the global scale. And this is a quote from that Global Biodiversity Framework, the supporting text in that Global Biodiversity Framework, that basically says that data are critical. And these data resources, good quality, accessible biodiversity data, is critical to conserving biodiversity in the future, and that it underpins every action that we might take. So if you want to do basically anything to conserve biodiversity in Canada or in the world, you need good data. And so that tells us that what we're doing is really key. What we're doing at Birds Canada is important, I believe, but also what you are doing as citizen scientists is really critical to the conservation of birds and other things going forward as well. And so that's just a thing that, like I say, I feel like when I participated in citizen science for years before I worked for Birds Canada or really had anything to do with this directly, and I always felt that it was important, but I couldn't really have told you specifically what it was doing. And so I think it's super validating to see how it's being used and to see that the value of it is being recognized on the global scale. So for me, that's very exciting. It also leads me into my little left turn here. So I'm going to take a little bit of a swing and spend the rest of my time chatting about something that's very exciting, our most recent and exciting development at Birds Canada and at NatureCounts, and that is the state of Canada's birds. And this is something that it's very timely because we announced and released the state of Canada's birds yesterday. So some of you might have seen some news about State of Canada's birds. You might have seen something on social media. If you haven't, that's okay, but it's out there now. So hopefully after this, you'll check it out. But for me, it's very exciting. It's been the product of a long development period, a lot of work by a lot of people, and it's a one-of-a-kind resource that we'll chat a little bit about here in our remaining time. Now, State of Canada's Birds, it's an online resource that you can explore on your own. So I won't get too deep into the information that you might find in there because you can run off and explore that just fine. But I will tell you a little bit about how it came about, why it exists, and what it is, and the role that citizen science data have played in State of Canada's Birds, which is really an incredible, I think, an incredible resource. And so what you should know about State of Canada's Birds is that it's based on or sort of built upon three things that already existed. The first is a website called the Status of Birds in Canada. This is a Government of Canada website. It's part of Environment and Climate Change Canada, and it provides species accounts, so one species account for most species of birds which live in Canada. And the species accounts give you all of the sort of best current information that the Government of Canada has on how that species is doing. It's a wealth of information. There's lots of good stuff in there. It is not the most user-friendly or approachable. It is almost like an internal resource for Government of Canada biologists. It is publicly available, but it's tough to get the most out of because it is really written in a way and developed in a way that isn't the most outwardly user-friendly. Not to run it down. The Environment Canada biologists would agree with me on that because we've discussed it before. So I don't feel too out of place in saying that. It's a great resource, but not the most accessible. On the flip side, we have the State of Canada's Birds report. So in 2012 and 2019, NABC Canada, which is the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, I believe, released with a bunch of partners, including Environment and Climate Change Canada and Birds Canada, these standalone reports called the State of Canada's Birds. And these reports were fairly concise. They're pretty short. They're meant to be a high-level summary of what we know the State of Canada's Birds is for general public consumption. So where Status of Birds in Canada was a lot of information, but not very accessible, State of Canada's Birds reports have a lot more selective information. So they're presenting sort of key information and key stories in a way that is very accessible and very approachable for anybody, regardless of their background. And then the third piece that underpins State of Canada's Birds is NatureCounts, which we've talked about at great length already. NatureCounts has this massive repository of raw data, so it's got this huge wealth of information, but it mostly is raw data. So it's not in a form that people can readily access and make sense of. It needs to be analyzed and interpreted and explained to be more useful. So the current State of Canada's Birds, the State of Canada's Birds 2024 that was released yesterday, aims to basically take the best parts of all three of these things to make the most comprehensive resource on the state of birds in Canada today. So we're taking the expert analysis and the detail and the information from the Status of Birds in Canada. We're taking that user-friendly approach from the State of Canada's Birds reports, and we're taking that wealth of information and data available in NatureCounts to make one cohesive thing. And that's the State of Canada's Birds. So the State of Canada's Birds, it's actually a partnership product between Birds Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada, and it consists of two connected parts. So we have on one side, species accounts. So one account for each species which regularly occurs in Canada. And on the other side, we have a summary report. So we're kind of taking the form factor from those earlier products and trying to improve upon it, make it as good as it can be. So species accounts and a summary report which connect together. And I'll give you a quick look at each one here now so you kind of have an idea what they contain. So first, those species accounts, one for each species that regularly occurs in Canada, like Canada Jay, for example. The species accounts, if you are an information junkie and you want all the information you can get on a given species of bird, the species accounts are where you should be. They provide tons of great stuff. So in these accounts, we have all the information that we currently have on the species in terms of its population trends. So is the population going up? Is it going down? Do all of our information sources agree on what's happening to the population? Should we be worried about it? All that good stuff. We have population goals. So each species, the project assigns a goal to. So do we need to recover this population? What should it look like by 2050 or in the long term? Is it doing okay? Is the population goal just to stay the course? So we have concrete conservation goals that help to guide conservation effort into the future. We've got information on the distribution of species and the seasonal occurrence, all kinds of good stuff. You can interact directly with the data. So you can look at these charts from different sources. This one happens to be from the Breeding Birds Survey, but you could also look at the Christmas bird count or other sources of data that we have on that bird in Canada, and you can actually see what the data are telling us. These data are pulled directly from NatureCounts live when you load the page. So this is not static. This is an actual dynamic live resource that pulls current data from NatureCounts. So you're getting the most up-to-date information on this species. You can also interact with maps. So you can, kind of in the same way that we did on the NatureCounts website, you can view population trends in real time. You can view where that species occurs and where it's breeding. You can view eBird abundance maps straight through the website here. You can view nesting information and occurrence calendars. So all kinds of good stuff. As I say, the species accounts are for your information junkies. If you really want to know as much as you can, that's the place to be. If you want the bigger, broader picture, if you're a little overwhelmed by all that information, that's totally fair. If you want a broad picture of what's happening to birds in Canada, that's where you need the State of Canada's Birds Report. So this is the user-friendly place to get an overall idea of what's happening to birds in Canada, to see the big stories, to see the big trends, to understand what's happening to the birds that live in this country. The report is the place to go. It is very pretty, I again say, with no stake in the game. But we had a wonderful artist and wonderful designer worked on the report, so it's very nice to look at, and it contains all kinds of excellent information. It begins with a graph that harks back to those earlier reports. So you may have seen graphs like this before. If you did see those earlier reports, we affectionately refer to this as the spaghetti plot. And it shows us trends for some groups of birds in Canada which tell important stories. 10 different groups, some of which have increased in the last 50 years, some of which have declined in the last 50 years, some of which are holding steady. So we've got these big stories from these major groups of birds in Canada. We can dive deeper into those groups, so we can see some of them broken down into subgroups that tell interesting stories themselves. The birds of prey, for example, are doing pretty well as a group. They're, in the last 50 years, having increased by about 35%, but a lot of that increase being driven by the diurnal birds of prey, the hawks and falcons and eagles, whereas owls are taking kind of a different trajectory. And so that's interesting to know. These groups are not homogeneous. They contain smaller stories within them, and we can highlight those here as well. We can feature some what we call hero species. So we can connect folks with these representatives of their groups, these sort of denizens. So, if we're talking shorebirds, it's nice to put a face on the shorebirds. And what better face could you ask for than Wimbrel? It's such a good face. And it tells an interesting story all unto itself. So we can highlight these hero species to connect people with real stories and to tie them back to those species accounts, which hopefully folks will be keen to explore as well. And we can see where some crises are occurring. And there's no doubt that the biggest crisis for Canada's birds is occurring in the prairies. So our grassland birds have declined very drastically. Those who are dependent on our native grasslands having declined by 90% in the last 50 years. So that's a very, very concerning story. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to draw attention to with this report. Now, of course, it's all well and good to say there is a problem, but we need to tell people what they can do with that problem as well. So throughout this report, you find lots of good information on how individuals can act for birds and how governments and larger organizations are already taking action for birds and can continue to do that as well. So we're trying to really tie these concerning stories to a positive and empowering message about taking action for birds in Canada, which we all can do, regardless of whether you're just an individual in your daily life or the government of Canada and everything in between. So there's lots in this report dealing with positive action as well. And I would be remiss not to include the fact that the information that underpins this report, the vast majority of it, just like NatureCounts, comes from citizen scientists. So literally, this product would not be possible without the contribution of citizen scientists. And a lot of the data coming from big projects like the Breeding Bird Survey, Christmas bird counts, provincial breeding bird atlases, but lots and lots of supplementary data coming from smaller, more regional projects or projects focused on particular birds. For example, owls were not included in the previous reports. So if you look back to those 2019 and 2012 reports, nothing at all about owls. And the reason that we can now include owls is entirely because of the Nocturnal Owl Survey, which occurs all across Canada, in all the provinces and territories. And it's really exciting to have that new information and to be able for the first time to highlight owls in a report like this. So it's really a concrete way that citizen science data is helping to engage Canadians, or all people in Canada, with bird conservation. And I think that's a pretty exciting thing. So I'll wrap it up about there. I hope that you'll take the opportunity, if you haven't already, to pop on over to State of Canada's Birds. You can access it at stateofcanadasbirds.org. It's all over the Birds Canada social media and stuff right now as well. So take some time if you can and explore the report and see what's really going on with our birds here, and see how maybe data you've participated in collecting is helping to spread this message and to analyze how birds are doing in the country. And if you're more curious about nature counts, you can absolutely pop on to naturecounts.ca. You can make maps, you can explore the data. If you are the kind of person who has a need for data, that's the place for you. So definitely head on over to naturecounts.ca. Otherwise, I'll just say thank you so much for having me here today and letting me ramble on about nature counts and state of birds. It's exciting to be able to do that always. And I'm more than happy to take any questions at all. And I'll turn it back over to, I guess, Kristen is going to go ahead and do question period.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kyle. That was incredibly insightful and incredibly timely. I had no idea that the State of Canada's Birds was released only yesterday, so I feel very privileged to have gotten that sneak peek right from the source. Thank you.
My pleasure, of course.
For the first question, as part of this series, we always ask our panelists, how are you driving change? But I'll admit, I personally thought that you had examples of that throughout your entire presentation, which was so appreciated. So I'm actually just going to start digging into the audience questions, because there are quite a few. And maybe you can continue to focus on that change piece when you're thinking about your responses.
Sure thing.
So from Norman, he asked, regarding data collection, do you also include bird banding data, such as the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network or the Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship Program?
For sure. So that's a good question. Yeah, about bird banding data. So Birds Canada in particular is quite involved in migration monitoring, because we operate the Long Point Bird Observatory right at our headquarters there in Port Rowan, Ontario. And bird banding data is a little bit different than what we have in NatureCounts for the most part. So NatureCounts deals primarily with occurrence data of birds. Bird banding data, obviously a little bit different. It includes some different information and some more information. So we don't host bird banding data specifically on NatureCounts, that we leave that to the bird banding lab. But what we do host in NatureCounts from those bird banding stations are two things. The first being what they call daily estimated totals. So while we don't have the individual sort of data on each bird, the band numbers and the morphometric measurements that they would take of the bird, each day those banding stations will submit their daily totals. So it'll say, today we caught this many red-eyed vireos and this many song sparrows and whatever else. And that is hosted in NatureCount. So if you're looking for simply that occurrence data at a banding station, we have that. But if you want the really detailed banding data, that comes from the banding lab. And the other thing that some of the banding stations will do, Long Point, for example, is they do a daily census. So every day during their season, they have somebody go out and walk a predetermined route and do a census of birds. That is occurrence data. And so that works very well in NatureCounts. And actually Long Point started this year piloting the NatureCounts app for their census. So that we do keep in NatureCounts as well. So yeah, we have a great partnership with the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network. We do host some banding related data, but for the detailed banding data, that goes to the banding lab, and that's where it should come from if people need it.
Nice, thank you. From Catherine, she has a technical question regarding interoperability. Is it up to the contributing source to reformat data before it is contributed, or do staff such as eBird staff make adjustments to their data sets to facilitate interoperability?
For sure, for sure. So all the data that goes into NatureCounts is in our sort of standard data form, which we call the bird monitoring data exchange. And it depends a little bit on how it's coming in, who does the conversion there. So data that's submitted through the NatureCounts app or through the online data entry portal, that's all formatted automatically. So when you submit from the app, of course, it just goes in the right form and you don't have to worry about it. For historical data sets that are uploaded, obviously they may already be in a form which is not what it needs to be. And so they do need to be converted. And the legwork for that, it usually is done by the folks who are submitting the data with some assistance from us. So we try to facilitate it and to help make it as easy as possible. But we don't always have the resources to do the actual conversion for them. So, if you've got an old historical data set and you want it to be hosted by NatureCounts, we would try to guide you through and give you the resources to do the conversion, but we would hope that you would be able to do a good bit of the actual legwork of converting it over. And the amount of legwork involved really varies. Sometimes it's fairly simple if the formats are close. Sometimes it does require some manual reformatting. So it just depends. But yeah, we try to work with folks to make it as easy as possible. But ultimately, the data contributor is going to do some of that legwork. Yeah.
From Frank, how is the data dictionary determined? For example, adding, retiring, or further refining the categories. Who does this work?
That's a good question. So the data dictionary, I'm thinking that maybe you mean the formatting, or so the way the data are formatted in terms of the different data fields. If I'm incorrect about that, definitely feel free to clarify for me. But the fields are very standard and they really don't change. And that's what gives us that interoperability. So it's quite a large number of fields. It's almost 300 fields. Not all of them have to be filled, so it's not like you're collecting 300 individual pieces of information. And it has some built-in flexibility. So some of the fields are flexible and can be used to collect different things. But the definitions of those fields and the formats within them stay the same forever, ideally. And that's what means we can compare data from last year to data that will be collected in 100 years because they stay very consistent. So I don't know if that fully addresses your question. If I misunderstood your question, definitely let me know. But yeah, that's my best take on that, I guess.
Yeah, Frank, feel free to add more clarification if you'd like a little bit more information about that. Another one from Catherine regarding ownership. When data is contributed from an external source, can you explain a little bit more about the agreement that supports data security and sovereignty? Sorry. And she says, for example, I'm curious if this is done by an MOU or on a license, such as Creative Commons licensing.
Yeah, we have a data sharing agreement. So this is essentially an MOU between us and the other organization. So whoever the lead organization is on the project, if it's an atlas, it's whoever's running the atlas or whatever the case may be. They sign a data sharing agreement, which outlines the terms through which the data can be shared. And they select a data sharing level. So those levels go from 0 through 5. 5 is absolutely wide open. Anybody can grab it whenever they want it. 0 is like nobody can even see the data. And then there are stages in between. Some of those stages require a request. So if your data are level 3 or level 4, they can be shared, but only after people request the data. And so people would submit a request for your data on NatureCounts on the website. And you can arrange to have either us, the NatureCounts team, look at that request and approve at our discretion, or for you to look at the request as the data owner and approve at your discretion. And so, yeah, it's done through a data sharing agreement and just trying to be very sensitive and make sure that we have something arranged that works for everybody. Of course, our goal is to share data. Our goal is for open data. So, if you're just looking for a place to kind of put data and squirrel it away and not have anybody ever look at it, it's not really what we're aiming for at NatureCounts, although there are some circumstances where that makes sense. But we do want to make sure that when those data are being shared, it's being done in a way that everybody feels good about and feels secure about, of course, as well. So hopefully that covers the question.
Yeah, I think so. And I might just put in a quick pitch for people who contribute to some of these citizen science applications that you consider whether or not you're willing to put a CCO license or other Creative Commons license so that your data can be easily shared and reused and applied to these kinds of projects. So Frank did say thank you for answering his question. I think we got to the gist of it. It sounds like the data is relatively non-dynamic, or changes are additive rather than requiring a record.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, is changes are additive. So we can always add things, but the data that are there, they are essentially static. Yes.
Okay. And then he has another question. How is the system funded?
Yeah, so how is it funded is a great question for sure. So Birds Canada is charitable. It is a charity, so we are funded like a lot of charities. Although a large part of our funding, certainly for NatureCounts, does come from a grant agreement with the federal government. So with Environment and Climate Change Canada, they are a huge partner in the project, and we also have funding from RBC Tech for Nature. Tech for Nature Fund, and from a few other funds as well. So like any charity, it is grants and donations and things like that. That's where the funding comes from.
And then a question from Bradley. Has there been any effort to quantify the human effort required to collect all this data or the economic impact of this effort? It's a huge undertaking and it would be nice to demonstrate this sector's impact.
Yes, so that's a very good question, and there have been efforts to do that. I wish I had some numbers on hand for you here now. There definitely have been approximations, or it's very difficult to really quantify it. But yes, that it definitely has been done, and I wish I had numbers to share with you. At Birds Canada, we engage tens of thousands of citizen scientists every year, 60 to 70,000 by our best calculations. And when you think about the number of hours that each of those people may put in, it gets very quickly into the sort of millions per year. And then if you assign a wage to those hours, if you were paying folks to do that, it just gets to an exorbitant number. So yeah, the contribution value of citizen scientists is like almost into the realm of numbers you can't really fully comprehend. It's wild. And that's why birds especially, and not that citizen scientists don't do other things, but the network of citizen scientists surrounding birds is so huge. That's why birds are really our best studied and best understood group of organisms, because it's just such an incredible citizen science effort, and it cannot be overstated how crucial that effort is to understanding birds and to the conservation of birds. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The value is monstrous. I don't have any specific numbers for you, but you can start to imagine the order of magnitude pretty quickly.
Oh, sorry, just for checking if the webinar is recorded. Yes, it is, Devin, so it will be posted to our website probably within a week or two. And another question from Bradley. Was the mapping and visualization tool built internally, or did you work with an external consultant to build this website?
That's a very good question. So the technical aspects of the development of the website are a little bit outside my wheelhouse, to be quite honest. And that tool was developed before I started, but I believe that the mapping tool was developed internally. I don't hope I'm not speaking sort of beyond my knowledge there, but I believe it was developed internally as far as I know. Yeah. Don't take that with a grain of salt. Don't hold me too responsible.
I think it would be fair to say that we're impressed. So we're wondering.
Well, I'm glad. I'll pass that along to our wonderful, we have an incredible team of developers and tech folks. And so yeah, I'll pass that along.
Yeah, it looks super interactive and highly visual, all the things that will help communicate the data for sure. From Tracy, what's next for the NatureCounts platform? Are there any new technological components that you're working on? Or what would you like to see in terms of evolution of the platform?
For sure. Yeah. So we have a relatively new strategic plan, which outlines all kinds of stuff. So if you really want to know, you can access our strategic plan and find out. But this is a lot of reading. For me, I think the most exciting things that are coming around the corner, the things that we're working to develop fairly quickly, is making the app especially a little more DIY, for lack of a better word. Right now, if you have a research project, let's say you have a bird monitoring project, and you want to use the NatureCounts app and you want to get that project into NatureCounts, it can absolutely be done, but it requires our NatureCounts team, which is wonderful but fairly small, to sort of do a bunch of legwork and set you up and get you set up in the app and all of that stuff. And that's great, but the interest is growing so quickly that that becomes a bit of a constraint because we just don't always have the time or resources to do that on a short turnaround. And so what we're trying to do, what we're working to do, is to make it DIY. So you have a monitoring project, you want to set it up in the app and for NatureCounts, we want there to be a nice user-friendly way for you to just do that yourself, with our support if you need it. But ideally, so that you can just set it up, you don't have to wait for us, you don't have to do it based on when there's availability and capacity in our team. You can get it set up pretty much on your own. So that's the next thing that's coming up around the bend and something that we're excited about. And we're also working on new ways to view and filter the data on the website and things like that. So everything that we're trying to do goes towards making it easier and better for citizen scientists and easier and better for people accessing the data. And there are lots of plans coming up around the bend. So it's exciting to see where it's going to go in the next few years.
No, that's great to hear. Do you mind if I asked how big your team is? I'm curious.
Yeah, so our sort of data science and management team, I always forget the exact name. The NatureCounts have it. It deals with MODIS as well. So you maybe have heard MODIS, which is tracking migrants. Super cool also. So we share some of the team with that, and it essentially it's grown a little bit recently, especially with State of Canada's birds. We have sort of I would say 6 folks who are focused on the tech side of that, all the way from sort of manager down to developers. So yeah, it's essentially 6 people, but they are dealing with both NatureCounts and MODIS. So it's really 6 halves, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, no small feat for both of those.
Yeah.
I'm going to remind everyone that this webinar is scheduled to 1:30. So I'm going to keep going. We are down to the last 2 questions in the chat. So feel free to add more if you want to pick Kyle's brain while we have his captive attention. The next one's from Laura. Is there a resource listing which species fit into each category, subcategory in the spaghetti charts? So for grassland birds, native grassland specialists, etc.
Yeah, so you can access that. So if you are on the State of Canada's Birds website, one of the pages is the methods, which is a lot. There's a lot of methods, which tell you how both the species accounts and the report were compiled and analyzed. And you can find descriptions of how those groups were sorted. So yeah, you can access that through those methods there. And there is a table of contents, so you don't have to scroll through tons and tons of methods. For some of them, it seems fairly obvious. For something like waterfowl, of course, like a waterfowl is a duck or goose or swan. That's pretty straightforward. For some of them, it's a little more complex. And there are birds that are on the edge, you can sort of debate over whether a bird is a grassland bird or is it a more sort of generalist bird that does live in grasslands. And so for the purpose of those analyses, birds were selected if they were particularly representative of a certain place. So it comes down to habitat associations, and then is that bird representative of that habitat? So yes, an American robin lives in grassland, but an American robin is an everywhere bird. It's not really a grassland bird. So chances are that what's happening with robin populations nationally, it's not really reflective of grasslands. And so a great deal of discussion and debate went into that between experts, both at Environment and Climate Change Canada and at Birds Canada, and that's how the decisions were made. But you can find the logic behind those decisions in the methods in State of Canada's Birds.
Sounds like we all need to dig in to the report. Another one from Frank. Can the tool be used as a platform to collect other non-bird related content that supports citizen science?
Yeah. So the NatureCounts, the way it works now, and the way that sort of bird monitoring data exchange works, it really is geared towards the collection of occurrence data for species. Now, it doesn't have to be birds. Of course, it was developed by Birds Canada, so it's been used for a lot of bird stuff, but it can also be used for other taxa. We have some amphibian records, we have some butterfly records, some data from the Trinational Monarch Network. We have some even plant records that are a part of the Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program. So it can collect data from all different groups of organisms, but it is really geared towards occurrence data and then the sort of additional parameters that you would collect, like effort and stuff that comes along with that. So, if I'm doing a bird count or a bird atlas, it's collecting all the data about the birds and where they occur, and then it's collecting things like weather data and how hard we worked, how long we were out there and how big our party was and things like that. So yeah, occurrence data and covariates, basically like weather and effort and things like that is what it's geared towards. And it is mostly bird data, but increasingly it's getting some interest from folks who work with other taxa as well. And it does work for that.
Yeah, and I might just add, Frank wrote me a note. Kristen, you know where I'm going with this. Frank is a director with the Stewards of Alberta's Protected Areas Society. So his group stewards protected areas across the province, and they are interested in weather data and all taxa, but also just general state of protected areas. So hopefully they're able to explore this platform some more.
For sure. Yeah. And we'd be happy to connect with you about whether NatureCounts might work for you. Absolutely.
From Bradley, can we talk a bit more about Birds Canada's relationship with Indigenous communities?
For sure. I would love to talk about that. I wish I knew a little bit more about it, to be quite honest. There's no doubt that we do have a relationship with Indigenous communities and we are working to engage with Indigenous communities, and that Indigenous communities are a huge part of the conservation of birds going forward, or definitely should be, and haven't always been at the table in the past, through no fault of their own, of course. I don't work directly with Indigenous communities in my position, so I don't want to speak too much to it in case I don't want to tell you the wrong things or try to sort of answer a question I don't have the knowledge to answer. So yeah, beyond that, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of specifics for you, but there is a lot of conversation happening within the organization to make sure that we are including that voice at the table in the way it should be, and making sure that we're including traditional knowledge and things like that as well, because there's no doubt about the role that it should be playing in conservation.
Yeah, I agree. I see enormous potential to leverage the resources that you have to advance Indigenous-led conservation and other important initiatives.
For sure.
From Tracy, this is a long one, bear with me. There is still stigmatism on using citizen science data. Bird research has successfully used this data for many years. Do you think people know the foundation of NatureCounts is data collected by citizen scientists? And what recommendations do you have for citizen science practitioners for other species or water or air projects to help address concerns with data quality?
For sure. I hope people know. It's something that we very much don't shy away from with NatureCounts, and now with State of Canada's Birds, we try to make a big deal of it because it is, I mean, as we say, pretty much the vast majority of the data underpinning both products is citizen science data. And we think it's really important that people know that. And I think it's true that with birds, it's seen a bit more positive uptake than maybe with some other taxa, because I think just because there's so much of it with birds, because of the community of birders. There's just a lot of citizen science data surrounding birds, and a lot of it is pretty good, I think. And so maybe it's seen more uptake with birds than with some of the taxa. I hope that things like the State of Canada's Birds show any doubters that, like, hey, you can do a lot with citizen science data. Like, it's so valuable. And here's sort of the proof in the pudding. And we see more and more sort of academic research and conservation decisions and stuff being conducted with citizen science data. So there's no doubt that with birds, there may still be detractors, there may still be doubters, but it has seen a lot of uptake. And I think attitudes towards it are shifting. Hopefully, those other taxa follow along if they're not already doing so. Maybe there's a way to sort of say, hey, look what they're doing with bird data, look what's being done over here. That can work for citizen science data from other projects and other taxa as well. Maybe birds can be the example in some way, but yeah, there's no doubt that attitudes towards it are changing, and I think that's great. One thing that we are able to sort of work towards with NatureCounts is in some ways supporting citizen scientists to make that data a little more, I don't know, a little more usable, I guess, or a little more to make people take it a little bit more seriously, because the data are collected in a really nice standardized way, because we can incorporate mechanisms for quality assurance and quality control. Maybe that helps folks to sort of say, hey, this data is coming from kind of an official source and they've thought about how to ensure the quality and that sort of thing. Maybe we should take it a bit more seriously. And so that's something that we think about as well. But yeah, I think it's coming. I think the revolution is happening, and people are starting to realize that like this is not just some folks out making things up. Like this is real, good, valuable data, and we can't ignore it. We have to use it. So hopefully that's the case.
Yeah, and it's a win-win. Not only are we engaging more people to go and collect data and interact with nature, but we're also leveraging the data to do good.
Of
So
course.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it works on both fronts, and I think that's fantastic.
Maybe along those lines, you mentioned QA/QC. Are there any other best practices that you would recommend for how you approach managing this ginormous data set?
Yeah, for us, QA and QC starts at the point of collection. We can kind of piggyback a little bit because our app, for example, it uses eBird filters. So if you observe an unlikely species or an unlikely number of something, we actually use the same filters that eBird uses to flag that and say, whoa, 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 like, hey, this species maybe shouldn't be here, provide some more information. And then that flags as well to reviewers. So if we've got, say, a breeding bird atlas, that breeding bird atlas is going to have regional coordinators, and they become then the reviewers for that data. So when checklists are submitted that have unusual records, they are notified and they can go through and sort of validate and communicate with the observer and that sort of thing. So I think that sort of multi-tiered system of checks and balances is really valuable, and having some way for somebody to review the data, because the citizen science observers, we never know sometimes, sometimes folks are absolute experts in their field. Sometimes folks are a little bit newer to it, as we talked about citizen science data being a great way to engage folks who are a little bit newer to collecting data like that. So having some checks and balances, having folks who are sort of experts in their area or their region who can review the data is a great way just to make sure that everything's looking good. And yeah, like I say, we cheat a little bit, not cheat, but we piggyback a little bit on those eBird filters, which is really useful as well.
We're getting close to the end. I saw Brad had one more comment. A lot of Albertans take place in the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey, and he just wanted to give a shout out to that great program. So
Nice.
thank you, Bradley, for that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic talk about a great single species program. The loon survey is awesome, and it's why we know as much as we know about common loons, for sure.
Okay. And I'll just ask one more of my canned questions as a last chance for anyone else to get anything in before we let Kyle go. How do you ensure the long-term sustainability of the Birds NatureCounts program? Are there any things that you would recommend to other initiatives, probably smaller scale, but
Yeah, NatureCounts is maybe it's a little bit unique, not being a citizen science program itself, but being a bit of a hub. But that's certainly something we're working to do, and a big part of it for NatureCounts ultimately is long-term funding, certainly, because it requires people to run it and technological resources and stuff like that. So that's something that we've been very fortunate about with the Environment Climate Change Canada and being a big supporter of the project. So for us, that long-term sustainability maybe comes out of partnerships a lot, and just building things in a way that we have a lot of forethought about where they're going to go in the future, and we're building a solid foundation. I think for smaller projects, probably that longevity does come in the form of whoever is essentially running the project. I think projects, they need a leader, whether it's one person or a committee of people or whatever it is, and ensuring that you have that good leadership in place and a plan for succession over time is probably a big way to ensure a bit of longevity. Because yeah, you do need that sort of leading force, as I say, whether it's one person or a group of people.
I'm taking that to heart. I started a small CitSci project last summer, and it quickly became untenable for me, but I'm regrouping on how to keep it going and grow it. So
the tricky thing with these, with any project, right, is especially if you start small, it can be hard to foresee how big it's going to become or what the needs will be in the future. And to some degree, it's impossible to fully foresee that, but the more you can think about it, the better, because they always grow beyond where you think they're going to be. Which we're at that point with NatureCounts now, where it's it's getting really big, and everybody's kind of going, whoa, whoa, like this is a big deal. So it's pretty exciting, but a little terrifying at the same time.
yeah, big but hugely influential and great for
Hopefully it is. That's the goal. Yeah,
policies and programs.
totally.
Okay, so no other questions have come in, so I'm gonna go into the wrap up. I am seeing a lot of thank yous coming into the chat now as well. So
Awesome.
thank you so much for answering all those questions. We really appreciate your time today. I can't understate how valuable it was getting that presentation right off the heels of publishing the State of Birds report. So I'm hoping that we can share this and hopefully spread the word a little bit more amongst Albertans. Also, thank you everyone for participating today. Your engagement and questions have made this valuable as always, and we really appreciate the active community of practice involvement. The next webinar in our series will be place-based partnerships with Dr. Patrick Hannington from the University of Alberta. And that webinar is happening in 2 weeks on Wednesday, same time, same place. So please register for that if you haven't already. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't give one final pitch to our in-person workshop happening at the end of the month, October 30th in Edmonton at the Bison Lodge. So this is our premier event of this whole series. We're hoping to bring the citizen science community of practice together in person for the first time since 2018 and really talk about how we've advanced the publication of our principles of good practice and where we're going to go next as a community. We'll also be launching the collaboration hub there, which is going to be really exciting. It's our new website where we're going to connect, celebrate, and collaborate amongst ourselves and advance all of our amazing projects here in the province and beyond. So thank you again, Kyle. It was wonderful having you today, and I will leave it there.
Awesome. Well, thank you as well. And thank you everybody for your awesome questions. Really enjoyed it.
Bye, everyone.